The shadows were growing long as Jake settled into the couch with a beer and the TV remote. It had been a long day at the office, and all he wanted was some mindless entertainment to unwind before bed. Flipping through the channels, he landed on an action movie, just reaching its climax. Gunshots and explosions filled the room as Jake let his thoughts drift, his body relaxing into the cushions. After a few minutes, a noise outside pulled him from the film. It was faint but distinct, the creak of wood underfoot. Jake paused the movie and listened intently, hearing only the usual evening sounds of birds settling in for the night. He was probably just being paranoid after the stressful week, he thought. But then it came again, closer this time. Rising slowly, Jake peered through the blinds of the front window. The street was empty and dark under the glow of the street lamps. Nothing seemed amiss. As he turned away, movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A shadow darted behind a large oak tree near the backyard fence. His heart leapt into his throat. Someone or something was out there. Jake pulled out his phone with trembling hands, ready to call 911 at a moment's notice. Approaching the back door, he peered through the small window into the darkness beyond. At first, he saw only the familiar shapes of lawn furniture and bushes. Then a hooded figure emerged, creeping along the fence line toward the house. Panic seized Jake's chest in an icy grip. This was no raccoon or stray cat. It was a person, and they were sneaking around his property under cover of night. As the figure drew nearer, Jake caught a glimpse of pale skin beneath the hood, confirming his fear that an intruder had found their way into his normally quiet neighborhood. Backing slowly from the door, Jake tried to steady his ragged breathing as 1,000 scenarios raced through his mind, each more terrifying than the last. What did this person want? To rob him, harm him. As the shadowy form drew up to the door and jiggled the handle, testing its lock, Jake knew he had to call for help immediately. But what if the intruder heard him? What if they broke in before the police arrived? The lock clicked as it was tested, and Jake jumped at the sound. Ducking into the adjacent laundry room, he pressed 911 and whispered his address to the dispatcher between panicked gasps. "There's someone outside, trying to get in. Please, hurry." Ending the call, Jake peered through the crack in the door as heavy footsteps circled the house. His entire body had gone cold with dread. Help was coming, but would it be fast enough? The footsteps stopped right outside his hiding spot, and Jake held his breath. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, with a loud crack, the back door splintered inward off its hinges. Jake clapped a hand over his mouth to stifle a scream. The intruder had broken in. The footsteps creaked across the hardwood floor toward the stairs. Jake pressed himself further into the corner of the cramped laundry closet, as if trying to disappear into the wall. His phone lay discarded at his feet, the line to emergency services still open, but useless, now that help was locked outside with the intruder prowling within. As the heavy tread climbed upward, Jake strained his ears to gauge the intruder's position. Each step brought them closer to discovering his hiding place. He thought desperately of ways to defend himself if found. There was a broom near the door that could be used as a weapon, or he might be able to slip past and lock himself in the bathroom for a moment of safety. But those were only fantasies. The intruder was surely larger and stronger than Jake's slender frame. His only real choice was to remain as still and silent as possible, praying they would pass him by. The footsteps creaked to a halt on the landing. Jake held his breath, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing but the pounding of blood in his ears. Then, the intruder's muffled voice called out gruffly, "I know you're in here. Come out now, and this doesn't need to get ugly." Jake's blood ran cold. They knew he was hiding, which meant escape was no longer an option. His only choice was to surrender or be dragged out by force. As the footsteps approached the closet, Jake braced for the inevitable confrontation. But instead of throwing open the door, the intruder's shadow passed by the thin crack of light beneath. Jake let out a shaky exhale of relief. The search continued down the hall, floorboards groaning under the intruder's weight. Jake listened anxiously to drawers being rifled through and doors banging open. No doubt in search of valuables. What else were they after? His life. The thought sent another wave of panic through him. He had to find a way to overpower them, or at least stall for more time. But every idea seemed hopeless against an armed intruder. As the rummaging drew nearer to the bedroom, Jake spotted his phone where it had fallen. The call was still connected. Maybe he could get the dispatcher's attention without alerting the intruder. Slowly, carefully, he inched his hand toward the device, cringing at every tiny sound. Just as his fingers closed around it, heavy footsteps turned and started back the way they came. Jake snatched his hand back into the closet as the intruder reappeared. They paused outside the laundry room, and Jake held his breath. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, faintly, the wail of sirens rose in the distance. The intruder muttered a curse and hurried downstairs, their footsteps pounding out the back door moments later. Jake let out the breath he'd been holding, lightheaded with relief. Help was coming at last, but he didn't dare leave the safety of the closet, not until the police had secured the house and apprehended the intruder for good. The ordeal was not over yet. Jake remained curled in the cramped closet long after the sirens had faded into silence, waiting for some sign that it was finally safe to emerge. His mind raced with questions. Had the police caught the intruder? Were they searching the neighborhood, or had the criminal slipped away into the night? He longed to call out and be rescued from his hiding place, yet fear kept him frozen, not daring to make a sound until he was certain the danger had truly passed. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, as Jake listened intently for any clues amid the deafening thud of his own heartbeat. At last, faint voices drifted up from downstairs, muffled but unmistakably belonging to the police. "Clear," one officer called out, followed by the creak of floorboards as they swept methodically through each room. Jake took a shaky breath, steeling himself. "Up here," he croaked, his voice hoarse from disuse. Heavy boots pounded up the stairs in response. A shadow fell across the laundry room doorway as an officer appeared, weapon drawn. "Police," came the gruff command. "Show yourself and keep your hands visible." Slowly, Jake emerged from the closet on trembling legs, raising empty palms to show he was unarmed. The officer's stern expression softened slightly at the sight of Jake, pale and disheveled in his hiding place. "It's all right, son," he said gently. "You're safe now. Why don't you tell me what happened here?" Jake recounted the night's harrowing events in a shaky voice, as other officers swept the house, confirming it was now secure. "Did you catch them?" he asked anxiously when he was done. The officer shook his head regretfully. "No sign yet, but we've got patrols out searching. In the meantime, I need to take your statement officially. Can you describe the intruder at all?" Jake struggled to recall useful details through his panic and fear. It was dark, but male, I think, wearing a hood so I didn't see his face. Tall, maybe 6 feet, and heavy-set. From the sound of his footsteps, the officer made a note. then asked gently, "Anything else you can remember might help us identify this guy. Did he say or do anything that stood out?" As Jake racked his brain, one unsettling detail emerged from the blur of terror. When he was searching the house, he called out and said to come out, or it would get ugly, like he wanted a confrontation, or... A chill ran through him at the memory. The officer nodded grimly. "Thanks. You've been a big help. I know this was traumatic, but you did the right thing calling us. We'll do everything we can to find this creep." Reassured but still shaken, Jake let the officers guide him outside to an awaiting ambulance. As the MTs checked him over, he gazed back at the house that no longer felt like a refuge. Somewhere out there, a faceless threat was still at large, and Jake found himself wondering just how close of a call it had truly been. Jake lay awake long into the night, replaying the intruder's taunting words on an endless loop in his mind. His home no longer felt safe, and the thought of sleeping alone with that faceless threat still lurking sent panic coursing through his veins. Every creak of the house settling seemed amplified, each shadow that flickered past the windows taking on a sinister shape. He tossed and turned restlessly, grasping for any sense of security as the hours dragged on. Finally, exhaustion overtook his frayed nerves, and Jake slipped into a fitful doze just before dawn. His dreams were plagued by hooded figures, prowling the house, always one step ahead of him, no matter how fast he ran. Their mocking laughter echoed through the empty rooms as Jake searched desperately for escape. A loud bang startled Jake awake with a gasp, heart pounding wildly. For a moment, disoriented by sleep, he thought the nightmare had followed him into reality. Then he registered the sunlight streaming through the windows and realized it had only been the trash cans toppling over in the alley. But the panic lingered, fueled by his frazzled state. Every small sound had him jumping at shadows now. The days that followed passed in a haze of restless unease. Jake called in sick from work, unable to focus on anything but his fraying nerves. He double-checked the new locks on every door and window, replaying the intruder's forced entry over and over, as if trying to prevent it through sheer force of will. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and well wishes, but their company only heightened Jake's lingering sense of vulnerability. At night, he dragged his mattress into the living room below the motion. Sensor security lights, unwilling to be trapped upstairs alone again. But no precautions could keep the nightmares at bay or still the pounding of his heart each time headlights swept past the windows. He found himself constantly peering through blinds, out the peephole, jumping at every small sound and shadow. A knock at the door a few nights later sent Jake scrambling for the baseball bat he now kept by the couch. Approaching cautiously, he peered through the peephole to find two uniformed officers waiting patiently on the porch. Heart in his throat, Jake opened the door. A crack. "We just wanted to check in," one said gently. "Any sign of the intruder?" Jake shook his head mutely, grip tightening on the bat. They exchanged a look before the other officer spoke. "I know it's unsettling, but try not to let the fear control you. You're doing all the right things. Now it's our turn to find this guy." Their reassurance did little to ease Jake's lingering unease as he bid them goodbye, locking the door securely behind their departure. In the following days, Jake threw himself into work with single-minded focus, hoping the distraction might dull his frayed nerves. But each night as darkness fell, bringing with it the memories of that fateful evening, the panic would rise again in his chest until he could barely breathe. Sleep became a battle against vivid nightmares, and waking offered no relief from the shadows that still seemed to lurk in every corner. Jake found himself wondering if this lingering fear would ever release its grip, or if some threats were impossible to truly escape. Jake awoke with a gasp, heart pounding from yet another nightmare. He lay still, waiting for his breathing to steady as shadows danced across the ceiling in the pale moonlight. Glancing at the clock, he sighed. Only an hour had passed since he last checked, unable to find rest. Sleep had become his enemy, plagued as he was by vivid memories of that night on an endless loop. Rising quietly, Jake padded into the kitchen for a glass of water. As the tap ran, he peered out into the darkened backyard, half expecting to see a hooded figure lurking once more. But the fence line was empty, swaying gently in the night breeze. He was alone. The realization brought little comfort these days. Alone meant vulnerable, with no one to call for help if danger found him again. In the following weeks, Jake moved through each day in a fog of exhaustion. He pushed himself to the brink at work, hoping physical and mental fatigue might force his mind into restful oblivion each night. But as soon as darkness fell, the panic would rise again like clockwork, fueled by every small creak and shadow. His home offered no refuge anymore, and the outside world held threats around every corner in his fraying state. Jake began to wonder if he was losing his grip on reality. Was he truly still in danger, or had his fear transformed normal sounds and sights into looming threats? He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, jumping at every unexpected movement. Colleagues at work started giving him a wide berth, no doubt unsettled by his jittery demeanor. But he couldn't seem to help it. Every instinct was primed for fight or flight. One night, as Jake lay staring at the ceiling, watching shadows dance, a thought occurred to him. What if the intruder was still out there, watching and waiting for another opportunity? The idea sent a chill down his spine. They knew where he lived now, his daily routines. Nothing was stopping them from returning under cover of darkness to finish what they started. With that terrifying possibility taking root in his mind, sleep became impossible. In the following days, Jake began to wonder if he was losing his grip on reality. Was he truly still in danger, or had his fear transformed normal sounds and sights into looming threats? He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, jumping at every unexpected movement. Colleagues at work started giving him a wide berth, no doubt unsettled by his jittery demeanor, but he couldn't seem to help it. Every instinct was primed for fight or flight. Jake knew he couldn't go on like this indefinitely. Something had to change before his fear consumed him entirely. But taking control of the situation seemed impossible when even the safety of his own home had been shattered. He was trapped in an endless cycle of panic and paranoia, with no end in sight. Some threats, it seemed, were impossible to escape, even if the intruder himself was no longer lurking in the shadows. Jake awoke with a start, heart pounding from yet another nightmare. He lay still, waiting for his breathing to steady as shadows danced across the ceiling in the pale moonlight. Glancing at the clock, he sighed. Only a few hours had passed since he last checked, unable to find rest. Something had to change. Rising determinedly, Jake threw on some clothes and headed downstairs. The dark corners of the house seemed less menacing in the glow of the motion sensor lights he had installed. Flipping on more switches, he let the illumination chase away the shadows as a plan took shape in his mind. If fear was controlling his life, it was time to take back his power and sense of security. Jake spent the next several days overhauling the home's defenses. He installed new locks, a security system with cameras covering all angles, and heavy-duty lighting around the perimeter. No intruder would be able to slip past unnoticed now. With each improvement, Jake's confidence and sense of control grew, slowly replacing the lingering panic that had gripped him for so long. His nightmares began to fade as well, now that real protections were in place. Sleep came easier as the house no longer felt like a vulnerable target waiting to be preyed upon once more. Jake started venturing out more during daylight hours, too, testing the limits of his hard-won comfort zone. Those shadows of unease lingered, facing each challenge, helped dull their power. A few weeks later, Jake was surprised to find himself looking forward to a neighborhood block party. The prospect of socializing no longer filled him with dread. Instead, he saw an opportunity to reconnect and feel secure in his community again. As dusk fell and lights flickered on in the cul-de-sac, Jake made his way over, shoulders back and head held high. "Jake, so good to see you out," called a neighbor, warmly. Smiles and greetings followed from others, genuine in their care for his well-being. Warmth bloomed in Jake's chest at their kindness. Those scars of that night would linger in taking back control of his life and surroundings. The grip of fear had loosened at last. Later, as Jake helped clean up, he gazed around at the illuminated street and neighbors laughing together. His home was now a refuge fortified against any threat, and his community offered the additional reassurance of support. Though vigilance would remain, so too had his sense of safety returned at long last. Some ghosts could not be outrun, but faced and overcome through strength and resilience of spirit. The nightmares were behind him now, and Jake's new normal had dawned at last.